Clara Whitmore never imagined humiliation could be so loud. The restaurant glittered with crystal lights and quiet wealth, the kind that made her instinctively sit straighter and speak softer. Margaret Whitmore had chosen the place, smiling too widely as she ordered champagne for the table. Evan sat beside Clara, scrolling his phone, detached. Clara already felt like a guest in her own marriage. When the bill arrived, Margaret didn't even glance at it. She slid the leather folder across the white tablecloth and stopped it directly in front of Clara. "Well," she said, laughing lightly, "you're the responsible one, aren't you?" Clara froze. The number stared back at her, far larger than she expected. She looked at Evan, waiting for him to speak, to clarify, to protect her. Instead, he stood up. Without warning, Evan lifted his glass and threw the red wine straight into Clara's face. Gasps rippled through the room. The liquid soaked her hair, her dress, her skin. People stared, no one moved. "Pay the bill," Evan said coldly, "or this ends here." Margaret laughed. Not nervously, not quietly. She laughed like she'd won. Clara felt something inside her split open. Not just embarrassment, but the sudden understanding that this moment had been planned. She wiped her face with shaking hands and stood up. Her legs barely held her. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply walked away while whispers followed her like shadows. Outside, the night air hit her hard. Her phone buzzed once, then died. She realized she had no cash, no ride, and no home waiting. Behind her, the restaurant doors closed. Fear mixed with relief because somewhere deep inside, Clara knew silence would no longer protect her from the life she endured. And Clara had no idea this was only the beginning. Before that night, Clara Whitmore had already lived a lifetime of quiet losses. She grew up in a small town in West Virginia, the oldest of 4 children in a house where money was always short and worry was always loud. When her mother died suddenly from an untreated illness, Clara was 16. She quit school the next month, took 2 jobs, and learned early that love often meant sacrifice without applause. Clara married Evan, believing adulthood would finally bring stability. He was charming, ambitious, and promised a future where she wouldn't have to carry everything alone. What she didn't see was how deeply he depended on his mother, Margaret, for money, approval, and identity. Over time, Evan's confidence turned into entitlement, and Clara's support became an expectation. Few people knew the truth about Clara's finances. She managed every bill, paid down Evan's failed business loans, and quietly sold her grandmother's jewelry to keep their credit intact. She told no one when collection letters arrived. She told no one when her savings disappeared. She believed protecting her marriage meant absorbing the damage silently. Margaret watched all of this with thinly veiled disdain. To her, Clara was useful but disposable. The woman without family connections, without wealth, without leverage. Every family gathering was a test Clara never seemed to pass. Every compliment came with a blade hidden inside. By the time the dinner invitation arrived, Clara was already exhausted. She hesitated before accepting, her instincts warning her something was wrong, but she went anyway, hoping, just once, that showing up would be enough. She never realized the evening wasn't about reconciliation or family bonding. It was about control, about forcing her into a public corner where refusal would come at a cost. And as Clara sat at that table, unaware of the trap closing around her, one truth remained painfully clear. Everything she had given had made her weaker in their eyes. They underestimated her resilience, not knowing endurance can transform into defiance when survival demands it at any moment. And the people she trusted most were preparing to use that against her. Clara did not know that her marriage had been built on conditions she never agreed to. From the beginning, Evan and Margaret shared an unspoken contract. Margaret provided the house, the car, the safety net. Evan provided loyalty. Clara, however, was never part of that agreement. She was expected to contribute, to comply, and most of all, to remain quiet. Love was never the currency in that household. Control was. Every month, Margaret reminded Evan who paid the property taxes. Every holiday, she reminded Clara that the home was temporary. Even their wedding had been funded with strings attached. Margaret chose the venue, the guest list, and the narrative, while Clara smiled through clenched teeth, grateful simply to belong somewhere. What Clara didn't see was how often Evan reported back to his mother. Private arguments, financial stress, moments of weakness, all of it traveled upward, reshaped into ammunition. When Clara cried in the bathroom over unpaid bills, Evan framed it as instability. When she asked for boundaries, he called it ingratitude. The luxury dinner was not a celebration. It was a demonstration. Margaret wanted witnesses. She wanted Clara placed in a position where obedience could be measured publicly. The bill was only the tool. The real goal was submission. Evan understood this, even if he never admitted it aloud. He had been taught that love was conditional and power was inherited. Standing up for Clara would mean standing against the hand that fed him. He chose comfort over conscience. As Clara adjusted her napkin that night, unaware of the verdict already decided, she believed the worst outcome would be an argument. She did not imagine betrayal dressed as entertainment. In Margaret's eyes, this dinner would end one of two ways. Either Clara would pay and prove her usefulness, or she would refuse and confirm her worthlessness. There was no scenario where Clara was meant to win. What none of them expected was that pressure, once absolute, can fracture suddenly when the wrong person is pushed too far. And the trap was already set long before the first glass was poured. Clara did not argue when Evan locked the door. She stood in the narrow hallway while the elevator hummed somewhere below, listening as the deadbolt slid into place. Her suitcase hit the floor a second later, followed by a trash bag stuffed with clothes. Evan did not look at her. Margaret stood behind him, arms folded, lips pressed into a thin, satisfied line. "You made your choice," Evan said. "You embarrassed us." Clara opened her mouth, then closed it. Explaining felt pointless. She bent to grab the suitcase, only to realize the zipper was broken. Clothes spilled out like evidence of a life suddenly rejected. Margaret stepped forward. "You were never a good fit," she said calmly. "Women like you survive by attaching yourselves to better families." The words landed harder than the whine. Clara felt her chest tighten, not from shock, but recognition. This was the judgment that had always hovered, now spoken out loud. She walked down the stairs because the elevator felt too slow. Outside, the air was sharp and cold. Her phone buzzed with a single message from Evan. "If you leave tonight, don't come back." Then the screen went black. Clara checked her wallet. No cash. Her cards were missing. She remembered Evan insisting earlier that he would handle payments tonight. The realization sank in with sick precision. A security guard watched from across the street as she sat on her suitcase. Cars passed. Laughter drifted from a nearby bar. The city did not pause for private disasters. For the first time, Clara considered how completely she had been erased. No house, no job security, no marriage. Even her version of events had no witnesses willing to speak. She rested her head on her knees and breathed through the panic, forcing herself not to cry. Tears felt like permission to break. She realized survival would require courage she had never been allowed to show, and strength no one expected her to possess alone tonight. Somewhere behind her, footsteps slowed, then stopped, and someone who saw everything was about to change the direction of her fall. Clara didn't look up when the footsteps stopped near her. She assumed it was someone asking her to move, or worse, someone staring the way people do when they sense weakness. Instead, a calm male voice spoke softly, careful not to frighten her. "Miss, are you hurt?" Clara lifted her head. The man standing a few feet away wore a faded security jacket and carried himself with the quiet steadiness of someone used to long nights. His name badge read Samuel Reed. He did not look at her torn clothes first. He looked at her face. "I'm fine," Clara lied, wiping her cheeks with her sleeve. Samuel didn't argue. He simply took off his jacket and held it out. "It's cold. You shouldn't be sitting here like this." Something in his tone broke through her defenses. Clara accepted the jacket, her hands trembling. The warmth made her eyes sting again. "I saw what happened inside," Samuel said. "No one deserves that." Those words did what hours of silence could not. Clara's breath hitched, and she turned her face away, ashamed of how badly she needed to hear them. Samuel stepped back, giving her space, as if he understood pain should never be crowded. They stood there quietly while traffic passed. Clara noticed his shoes were worn, his posture tired but proud. He wasn't offering solutions. He wasn't asking questions. He was simply present. "I don't have anywhere to go," Clara said finally. Saying it out loud felt like admitting defeat. Samuel nodded once. "Then we start with something small." He walked her to a bench beneath a streetlight and bought her a coffee from a nearby cart using cash folded carefully from his wallet. He didn't ask her story. He didn't tell his own. He only reminded her to drink slowly. As Clara wrapped her hands around the warm cup, she felt something unfamiliar return. Safety. And for the first time that night, she realized she might survive what was taken from her. But Clara had no idea who Samuel Reed really was or why fate had placed him there. By morning, everything collapsed at once. Clara woke on the narrow couch of a 24-hour shelter Samuel had quietly arranged, her body aching from a night of broken sleep. For a few seconds, she forgot where she was. Then reality rushed back in, sharp and unforgiving. Her phone buzzed nonstop the moment she turned it on. First came the email from work. "Due to serious allegations brought to our attention, your position is suspended pending investigation." Her hands went numb. Minutes later, a bank notification followed. Her joint account with Evan had been frozen. Another alert confirmed what she already feared. An overdraft notice tied to a loan she never remembered approving. By noon, the final blow arrived. A courier handed her a thick envelope. Inside were legal papers. Evan was filing for divorce, citing financial misconduct and emotional instability. Margaret's lawyer had already moved to shift every shared debt onto Clara's name. It was efficient, ruthless, perfectly timed. Clara sat on the edge of the shelter bed, staring at the wall as voices echoed down the hallway. People laughed somewhere. Someone cried. Life continued without noticing hers had just imploded. She tried calling Evan. Straight to voicemail. She texted, no reply. When she finally called Margaret, the line connected for exactly 3 seconds before going dead. That was when the weight became unbearable. Clara slid down to the floor, pressing her back against the wall, breath shallow and uneven. She felt stupid for ever believing loyalty would protect her. Stupid for confusing endurance with strength. The thought crept in quietly, dangerously. Maybe this is where it ends. Her hands shook as she covered her face. Not sobbing yet, still holding on to pride, even now, still fighting the instinct to disappear. Then her phone lit up again. A single text from an unknown number. "You're not alone, I meant what I said. Meet me downstairs." It was Samuel. Clara didn't know why he came back. He owed her nothing. Yet as she stood and wiped her face, she felt something shift. Not hope, not relief, determination. Because when everything is taken at once, there is nothing left to lose but silence. And Clara was done being silent. What Samuel would reveal next would change how she fought back forever. Samuel did not take Clara somewhere impressive. He led her down a side street to a small community center tucked between closed shops and flickering streetlights. Inside, the air smelled like old coffee and disinfectant. A handful of people sat around a folding table talking quietly. They looked ordinary, tired, real. "This is where people land when the system drops them," Samuel said. Clara hesitated, clutching her bag. She expected pity. Instead, she received nods. No one asked what she had done wrong. No one asked why she was there. An older woman named Ruth slid a chair out for her. "Sit, breathe," she said gently. Over the next hour, Clara listened. A contractor framed for fraud by his partner. A nurse blacklisted after reporting abuse. A widow buried under medical debt. Their stories overlapped in familiar ways. Power, silence, shame. Samuel finally spoke. He explained that this group shared resources, not money, knowledge, contacts, time. Each person had once been helped by someone else, then stayed to help the next. Clara felt something shift. She wasn't a singular failure. She was part of a pattern. When she admitted her accounts were frozen and her job suspended, no one flinched. A retired accountant offered to review documents. A former paralegal asked for names. Ruth handed Clara a notebook. "Write everything," Ruth said. "Facts beat fear." For the first time since the restaurant, Clara felt steadiness return to her hands. Not rescue, preparation. Samuel walked her outside later, the night colder than before. "This won't be fast," he warned, "and it won't be gentle." Clara nodded. She had endured worse quietly. "What if I lose anyway?" she asked. Samuel met her eyes. "Then you'll lose standing up." As Clara watched the center's lights dim behind them, she realized survival no longer meant enduring alone. It meant learning the rules her enemies used and refusing to disappear. The truth would surface tomorrow, and nothing remain hidden. By the next morning, Clara learned the first truth that changed everything. The retired accountant, a soft-spoken man named Howard, spread printed bank statements across the table. He worked slowly, methodically, circling numbers in red ink. Clara watched, her stomach tightening with every page. "These signatures," Howard said, tapping the paper, "aren't yours." Clara leaned forward. The handwriting looked close enough to fool a bank, but not close enough to fool someone trained to look for pressure marks in stroke order. Entire loans had been taken out in her name, credit lines opened, extensions signed, all without her consent. The paralegal, Denise, cross-checked timestamps. "These were approved when you were at work," she said. "Security cameras, time cards, emails. That's not coincidence." Clara's breath caught. For months, she had blamed herself for being careless, for not paying attention. The truth was far worse. Evan hadn't just failed her. He had used her. Samuel stayed quiet, watching Clara's face as the realization settled in. This wasn't just betrayal. It was a crime. "We can report this," Denise said. "Forgery, financial fraud." Clara nodded automatically, then stopped. Fear surged through her. Reporting it now would alert Evan and Margaret immediately. They had money, lawyers, and influence. She had none of that yet. "What happens if I do this wrong?" Clara asked. Howard folded his hands. "Then they bury you in paperwork until you give up." Silence filled the room. Samuel finally spoke. "Then we don't rush." They explained the alternative. Document everything, build a timeline, secure witnesses. Let Evan believe his plan worked. Let Margaret grow careless. It felt backward. Letting injustice sit longer went against every instinct Clara had, but she also understood something new. She had been surviving. Now she needed to think. That afternoon, Clara received another email. Her job suspension was becoming permanent unless she could clarify discrepancies. Evan had already spoken to her supervisor. He was controlling the narrative. Her hands shook, but she didn't cry. Instead, she opened the notebook Ruth gave her and wrote one sentence at the top of the page. "They think I am finished." She underlined it twice. Because for the first time, Clara wasn't reacting. She was preparing, and preparation made her dangerous in ways they did not expect. And the next move would belong to her, not them. Margaret Whitmore's name had always carried weight. In the neighborhood where she lived, people lowered their voices when they mentioned her. She donated to charities, hosted fundraisers, and sat on boards that gave her influence without accountability. To the outside world, she was a respected widow who had held her family together. Inside the group's small office, that image began to crack. Denise returned late that evening with a thin folder and a look that sharpened the room. Margaret didn't just control her son, she said. She controlled money that wasn't hers. Years earlier, when Margaret's husband died suddenly, she filed an insurance claim worth millions. Officially, it was clean, but buried records told a different story. A rushed medical evaluation, a beneficiary change filed days before his death, a signature that didn't match earlier documents. Howard adjusted his glasses. "This was flagged once," he said quietly. Then it vanished. Clara felt her stomach drop. Vanished how? "Pressure," Denise replied. "Someone made it disappear." They dug deeper. Margaret had used that payout to buy property, fund Evan's ventures, and establish her social standing. Everything Clara thought was stability had been built on a lie that never faced daylight. Clara stared at the papers, her hands steady in a way that surprised her. All the insults, all the tests, all the control. Margaret hadn't despised weakness. She feared exposure. Samuel leaned back, crossing his arms. People like her don't panic unless the threat feels real. Clara understood then why Margaret had orchestrated the restaurant humiliation. It wasn't about money, it was about leverage. Keeping Clara small meant keeping her ignorant. A woman burdened with debt doesn't ask questions. That night, Clara went back to the shelter and lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She replayed every comment, every subtle warning she had ignored. The puzzle pieces aligned with brutal clarity. Margaret had never underestimated her kindness. She had underestimated her patience. In the morning, Clara made a decision that surprised everyone. "We don't confront her," Clara said. "Not yet." Denise raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" Clara nodded. People who hide secrets get careless when they think they've won. For the first time, Clara wasn't afraid of Margaret Whitmore. She was waiting, and soon, Margaret would make the mistake that exposed everything. When Clara thought the ground could not drop any lower, it did. The court hearing arrived faster than expected. Evan's lawyer requested an emergency motion, claiming Clara was hiding assets and manipulating records. Margaret sat behind him, dressed in gray, eyes calm, already confident. Clara stood alone, wearing borrowed clothes, her evidence still incomplete. The judge listened. Evan spoke first. He cried. He talked about betrayal, stress, fear. He said Clara controlled the finances and shut him out. He said he was a victim. His voice shook at the right moments. Clara waited for her turn. When it came, her words felt small in the room. She explained forged signatures, missing money, and unanswered questions. Without official filings, it sounded like suspicion, not proof. The ruling came quickly. The court denied her request for immediate protection. Her accounts would remain frozen. Evan was granted temporary control over shared assets. Clara felt the air leave her lungs. Outside the courtroom, reporters waited. Margaret walked past them, placing a hand on Evan's arm like a grieving mother. Cameras flashed. Clara slipped out the side door unnoticed. By evening, the consequences multiplied. Her employer finalized her termination. Without access to funds, she missed a payment on her phone bill. The screen went dark. Silence closed in. Clara returned to the shelter and sat on her bed, unmoving. For hours, she stared at the wall. No tears came, just exhaustion so deep it felt physical. A thought crept in, slow and dangerous. Maybe fighting only prolongs the fall. She pictured disappearing quietly. No courtrooms, no humiliation, no explaining herself anymore. Her hands curled into fists, her chest tightened. She stood, then sank back down, shaking. At that moment, a knock echoed softly on the door. Samuel's voice followed, low and steady. "You still with us, Clara?" She didn't answer right away, but she stood up. Because if this was rock bottom, then there was nothing left to protect but her will. And losing that was not an option. She inhaled slowly, realizing survival itself was now an act of quiet, stubborn rebellion against them. Clara opened the door, and the moment she saw Samuel's face, the last of her control cracked. She didn't collapse. She didn't scream. She simply stepped back and sat on the edge of the bed as if her body had finally accepted what her mind had been fighting all day. Samuel didn't rush in. He stayed near the door, giving her space, the way people do when they understand that pain needs room to breathe. "I saw the ruling," he said quietly. That was all it took. Clara pressed her palms against her eyes, but tears slipped through anyway. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady, exhausted tears that carried months of swallowed fear and years of silent compromise. She cried for the court that didn't listen, for the life she tried to protect, for the version of herself that believed loyalty would be returned. "I did everything right," she whispered. "I worked, I paid, I stayed calm. I never hurt anyone." Samuel nodded once. "I know." She looked up at him then, anger flashing through the grief. "So why does it feel like I'm the one being erased?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled a chair closer and sat down, finally meeting her at eye level. "Because systems protect patterns," he said, "not people." The words settled heavy but true. Clara stood suddenly and paced the small room, her hands shaking. "They want me tired, confused, quiet. They want me to disappear so this all stays clean for them." Samuel watched her carefully. "And are you going to give them that?" She stopped moving. For a long moment, Clara said nothing. Then she straightened her shoulders, wiping her face with the back of her hand. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "No," she said, "but I can't fight them the way I am now." Samuel leaned forward. "Then don't." She frowned. "What do you mean?" "You stop reacting," he said. "You stop trying to prove yourself to people who already decided your role, and you start building something they can't control." Clara felt it then. Not hope, not relief. Clarity. This wasn't the end of her strength. It was the moment it finally changed shape. And from that night on, Clara stopped trying to survive and started planning to win. Clara didn't plan to tell her story to anyone outside the room. It happened quietly, almost by accident. Denise mentioned a small independent podcast run by a former journalist who focused on workplace injustice and emotional abuse. No sponsors, no corporate filters, just voices that had been ignored elsewhere. "They won't protect you," Denise said, "but they won't silence you either." Clara hesitated for 2 days. Going public felt dangerous. Evan and Margaret were already controlling the narrative. One wrong word could be twisted, used against her in court, but silence had already cost her everything. So she agreed on one condition: no names. The recording took place in a cramped studio above a laundromat. No cameras, just microphones, and a red light that felt heavier than expected. When the host asked her to describe the restaurant incident, Clara's throat tightened. She closed her eyes and spoke anyway. She talked about humiliation dressed as humor, about money used as a leash, about being punished for saying no. Her voice didn't shake when she described the wine, or the laughter, or the lock turning behind her. It steadied with every sentence, as if truth itself was holding her upright. The episode aired 3 days later. At first, nothing happened. Then comments appeared, women sharing eerily similar stories, men admitting they'd watched and said nothing. Messages poured in from strangers who recognized the pattern immediately, even without names attached. The clip spread faster than anyone expected. By the end of the week, local media picked it up, still anonymous, still careful. But the pressure shifted. Suddenly, people were asking questions about financial control, about emotional abuse, about how often private family matters looked exactly like this. Clara watched the reaction from a distance, heart pounding. She wasn't being praised. She wasn't being saved. She was being believed. Evan called that night. She let it ring. Margaret's lawyer sent a warning email the next morning. Clara didn't reply. For the first time since the restaurant, the power dynamic tilted slightly, almost imperceptibly. Not enough to win, not enough to relax, but enough to make them nervous. And Clara understood something crucial. She didn't need to destroy them. She only needed to keep the light on long enough for others to see what had always been there. And once the truth started moving, it refused to stop. Evan Whitmore had always believed he could control the story. When the podcast began circulating, he dismissed it as harmless noise. No names, no proof, just emotions. He told Margaret it would fade. She agreed, confident as ever. But Evan underestimated one thing. The people who recognized him did not need his name spoken. It started with a message from an old coworker, then another. Then a woman he hadn't seen in years commented publicly, asking why his behavior sounded familiar. Evan felt the room shrink around him as his phone kept vibrating. By the third day, a former girlfriend reached out to the podcast host directly. She didn't hesitate. She provided screenshots, loan agreements, and voice messages Evan never thought she kept. In them, he promised love, marriage, repayment. None of it had happened. Another woman followed, then another. Patterns formed quickly. Evan borrowed money, failed, blamed stress, and disappeared. Always with someone else paying the price. Always with Margaret stepping in quietly to clean the edges. Local reporters connected the dots. One article led with a careful headline about financial exploitation within relationships. Evan's photo wasn't attached, but the timeline was unmistakable. His employer called him in for a meeting. This time, he didn't cry convincingly. Questions came faster than excuses. Internal audits began. At home, Margaret's confidence cracked. She snapped at Evan, demanding he fix it. He shouted back for the first time in his life, accusing her of putting Clara in the spotlight. The silence that followed was thick and unfamiliar. That night, Evan sat alone, scrolling through comments he couldn't delete. Strangers called him out with precision that felt surgical. He realized something terrifying. The narrative was no longer his, and the woman he had humiliated, controlled, and discarded was now the quiet center of a story that kept expanding without her saying another word. He finally understood fear, not as panic, but as exposure, the kind that strips excuses away and leaves consequences standing where lies once felt safely hidden from everyone watching closely. Evan's phone rang again. This time it was the police. Margaret Whitmore had survived scandals before. When the first article mentioned a prominent widow with community influence, she smiled and closed her laptop. She had lived long enough to know how these things worked. Stories burned fast, then disappeared. Money softened edges. Time erased details. But this time felt different. The calls started coming from people who had never questioned her before. A board member asking for clarification. A charity director requesting a private meeting. A lawyer friend advising her to stay cautious. No accusations yet, just distance. Margaret hated distance. She pulled old files from a locked cabinet, hands steady but jaw tight. Documents she hadn't looked at in years, the insurance claim, the beneficiary change, the doctor's signature that had once made her heart race until it vanished into silence. She told herself it was fine. It had always been fine. Then the letter arrived. Not a lawsuit, not a charge. A notice of review from an insurance oversight committee reopening dormant cases flagged for irregularities. Her husband's name sat neatly typed at the top. Margaret's breath stalled. She called Evan immediately. He didn't answer. When he finally did, his voice was strained, defensive, unfamiliar. He talked about audits, police questions, accounts being examined. He asked what she had done years ago. Margaret slammed the phone down. For the first time, she felt the absence of control. The people who once laughed at her dinners were no longer returning invitations. Donations were being quietly declined. Whispers followed her in rooms where she used to command attention. At night, Margaret replayed memories she had buried. The rushed paperwork, the pressure, the certainty that she deserved security at any cost. She had told herself she was protecting her son. Now that protection was unraveling. She tried to call Clara once, late at night, rehearsing a version of regret that sounded reasonable. The call went unanswered. Margaret stared at the dark screen, realizing something she had never allowed herself to consider. Power only works when people believe in it. And belief, once cracked, does not return. Margaret Whitmore was about to face a past she thought was permanently buried. The final hearing did not feel dramatic. There were no raised voices, no sudden confessions, no moments designed for television. It felt quiet, almost procedural, which somehow made it heavier. Clara sat at the long table with Denise beside her, hands folded, posture steady. She did not look at Evan when he entered. She did not look at Margaret either. This time, Clara was not alone. Evidence was presented carefully, piece by piece. Bank records showing forged signatures. Emails time-stamped while Clara was at work. Audio messages Evan had forgotten existed. One by one, the lies lost their shape. When the insurance review findings were introduced, Margaret stiffened. The judge paused longer than before, reading silently. The room felt suspended, as if everyone understood that something irreversible had just crossed the line. Evan's lawyer tried to interrupt. The judge raised a hand. "No," she said calmly, "we're past that." Evan finally spoke, his voice thinner than Clara remembered. He tried to explain. He blamed stress. He blamed misunderstanding. He blamed love. The words fell flat, collapsing under the weight of documentation. Margaret did not speak at all. The ruling came in stages. Evan was found liable for financial fraud and identity misuse. Criminal proceedings would follow. Clara's debts were formally dismissed, accounts unfrozen, her name cleared. The court acknowledged deliberate manipulation intended to cause harm. Margaret's case was separated, referred for further investigation, civil and criminal. Her expression did not change, but something behind her eyes dimmed. Clara listened without reacting. No smile, no tears, just breath, steady and real. When it was over, she walked out into the sunlight alone. The air felt different. Lighter, not because she had won, but because she had been heard. Denise touched her arm. "You." Clara nodded. She hadn't destroyed anyone. She hadn't demanded revenge. She had simply refused to carry what was never hers. And in that refusal, everything shifted. For the first time, the future belonged entirely to her. Clara expected relief to feel louder. Instead, it arrived quietly, in small, almost forgettable moments. The first was waking up without panic tightening her chest. The second was checking her email and seeing her name cleared officially in writing. No accusations, no conditions, just truth restored. What surprised her most was what she didn't want. She didn't want Evan's money. She declined the option to pursue additional damages. She didn't want Margaret's house, her status, or anything that tied her back to that world. What Clara wanted could not be transferred or inherited. She wanted agency. Within weeks, Clara was offered a position at a nonprofit that worked with women facing financial coercion and legal manipulation. They didn't see her as a victim. They saw her as someone who understood systems from the inside, someone who knew how quiet damage was done. Her job title was modest, financial case coordinator. The work was hard and unglamorous. Long hours, heavy stories, but for the first time, her skills were not being drained to support someone else's illusion of control. She rented a small apartment near the river. Nothing fancy. Sunlight in the mornings, a door that locked because it belonged to her. On the wall, she hung nothing from her past. No wedding photos, no apologies. Samuel visited sometimes. They drank coffee, talked about ordinary things. There was no promise, no pressure, just mutual respect and shared silence. That was enough. One evening, Clara received an email from a woman she had never met. The subject line read, "You helped me leave." Clara read it twice, then once more. That was when she understood what she had been given. Not wealth, not revenge, not a dramatic transformation. She had been given back her name, her voice, and the ability to choose who she became next. And nothing could take that from her again. Clara Whitmore was no longer surviving someone else's life. She was finally living her own. Evan's fall was not sudden. It was slow, humiliating, and public in ways he never imagined for himself. After the ruling, his employer released a brief statement confirming his termination due to ethical violations. Friends stopped returning messages. The same people who once admired his confidence now avoided eye contact when they saw him on the street. Without Clara managing the details of his life, small things unraveled quickly. Bills went unpaid, deadlines were missed, excuses no longer worked. The criminal investigation moved forward quietly. Evan was charged, not dramatically arrested on television, but summoned, questioned, documented. His name appeared in local records tied to fraud and identity misuse. Each entry felt like another door closing. Margaret fared worse in a different way. Her social circle dissolved with surgical precision. Invitations stopped arriving. Board positions were restructured. Charities returned her donations with polite letters citing policy changes. The insurance investigation advanced, uncovering inconsistencies she could no longer explain away. She was not arrested immediately. That almost made it crueler. Margaret remained in her large house, surrounded by expensive furniture and silence. Neighbors who once waved now nodded stiffly or crossed the street. Power had insulated her for decades. Without it, she was simply a woman facing the weight of her choices alone. Neither Evan nor Margaret tried to contact Clara again. They didn't apologize. They didn't threaten. They faded, shrinking into the consequences they had spent years avoiding. No dramatic punishment, no spectacle. Just accountability. Clara heard updates through Denise, filtered and factual. She listened without satisfaction, without bitterness. What she felt instead was distance, emotional and permanent. One afternoon, Clara stood by the river near her apartment, watching the water move steadily forward. She thought about how much energy she had once spent being small so others could feel large. That chapter was closed. Evan and Margaret were no longer villains in her story. They were lessons she no longer needed to revisit. Justice, Clara realized, did not always look like victory. Sometimes, it looked like walking forward while others stayed exactly where their choices left them. And Clara never looked back to check if they were watching. Clara's life did not transform overnight, but healing rarely announces itself loudly. Mornings became quieter. She learned the comfort of routine. Coffee brewed slowly, windows opened, sunlight touching the floor without asking permission. There were still nights when memories surfaced, sharp and unwelcome, but they no longer controlled her breathing. At the nonprofit, Clara listened more than she spoke. Women arrived carrying the same fear she once carried, convinced their confusion meant failure. Clara never rushed them. She showed them documents, timelines, options. She showed them how power hides in plain sight. Some days, she went home exhausted, but it was a clean exhaustion, earned without shame. Samuel remained a constant presence, never demanding a role. Sometimes they walked by the river, sometimes they sat in silence on opposite ends of a bench. He never asked what she felt. He noticed when she was ready to speak, that patience became its own kind of safety. One evening, after a long day, Clara found herself laughing. The sound surprised her. It felt unfamiliar, almost fragile but real. She realized she had not laughed freely in years. The weight in her chest loosened just slightly. Healing did not erase the past. It reorganized it. The restaurant, the wine, the courtroom all became memories instead of wounds. They no longer defined her decisions. Clara stopped measuring her worth by endurance. She stopped apologizing for boundaries. When something felt wrong, she trusted that feeling without explanation. Late one night, she wrote in her notebook again. This time, the sentence was different. I am allowed to exist without proving my value. She closed the book and slept deeply. Peace, she learned, was not the absence of pain. It was the absence of fear of pain returning. And in that quiet understanding, Clara felt something settle into place, something solid and lasting. She was no longer bracing for impact. She was finally at rest. For the first time since her marriage began, Clara trusted the future enough to imagine it gently, without fear, without urgency, and without anyone else deciding who she should be anymore now. Clara returned to the restaurant on a rainy Thursday evening. Not out of nostalgia, not out of anger. She came because the nonprofit was hosting a small fundraising dinner there, an invitation extended quietly, deliberately. The irony did not escape her, but it no longer hurt. The restaurant looked the same: soft lighting, crisp linens, the faint hum of money pretending to be comfort. As Clara stepped inside, no one recognized her. She was not the woman with wine in her hair anymore. She was simply another guest, composed, calm, unremarkable in the best possible way. She took her seat near the window. Outside, the rain traced slow lines down the glass. Inside, conversations rose and fell, laughter, clinking glasses, life continuing. Halfway through the meal, Clara noticed a young couple at the next table. They whispered urgently, glancing at the menu, then at each other. Their discomfort was familiar. When the server brought the bill, the woman's face fell. The man shook his head slightly, embarrassed. Clara didn't hesitate. She stood, walked over, and spoke gently. "Please let me take care of it," she said. No explanations needed. The couple protested at first, then stopped when they saw her expression. Gratitude softened their tension. The woman's eyes filled with tears she tried to hide. Clara returned to her seat without ceremony. When the server came back, Clara paid her own bill as well. The number no longer frightened her. It was simply a number. It did not define her. As she stood to leave, Clara paused near the entrance. For a brief moment, she remembered the sound of laughter that once followed her out of those same doors. The cold air, the feeling of being discarded. The memory passed. Outside, the rain had slowed. Clara breathed in deeply, then exhaled, steady and unafraid. She did not feel triumphant. She felt complete. Full circle did not mean returning to who she was. It meant standing in the same place as someone entirely new. And this time, when Clara walked away, she carried nothing that needed to be forgiven or forgotten, only something solid: peace. The past no longer waited for her here, and the future finally walked beside her. Clara's life settled into something honest. Not perfect, not dramatic, honest. She continued her work at the nonprofit, building systems that protected people before damage became irreversible. Her name became quietly respected in circles that valued integrity over power. She was invited to speak, not as a survivor, but as a professional who understood how harm hides behind respectability. She moved again, this time to a small house with a porch and a garden she tended herself. Dirt under her nails felt grounding. Growth made sense there. You planted, you waited, you cared, and something real emerged. Samuel remained in her life, not as a savior, not as a promise, but as a steady presence. Some evenings they cooked together. Other nights, they sat apart, reading. There was no rush to define what they were. Clara had learned that safety did not require labels. Occasionally, she heard updates about Evan and Margaret through distant channels. Evan accepted a plea deal and faded into anonymity. Margaret's case ended quietly, her reputation dismantled beyond repair. Clara felt no satisfaction from it, only closure. What mattered was what followed. One afternoon, Clara received a letter from a woman she had helped months earlier. The woman wrote that she had left safely, rebuilt her finances, and enrolled in school. At the bottom, she added one line: "You showed me what dignity looks like." Clara read it twice, then placed it in a drawer she reserved for reminders on difficult days. That night, Clara stood on her porch as the sun went down. The air was warm. The world felt wide again. She thought about the woman she used to be, measuring herself by how much she could endure. That woman was gone. In her place stood someone who knew her worth without needing permission, approval, or sacrifice. Someone who understood that kindness and strength were not opposites. Clara smiled, not because she had won, but because she was free. And freedom, she learned, was the greatest reward of all, because the life she rebuilt was finally, undeniably her own. Years later, Clara Whitmore rarely thought about the night that changed everything. Not because it had lost meaning, but because it no longer carried pain. It had become a reference point, not a wound, a reminder of where her life divided into before and after. On a spring afternoon, Clara sat in a small conference room surrounded by women taking notes, asking questions, planning exits. Some were afraid, some were angry, some were still unsure if they were allowed to choose themselves. Clara listened, answered carefully, never positioning herself above them. "I didn't become brave," she told them. "I just stopped agreeing to disappear." Those words stayed with them. After the session, Clara walked home instead of taking the bus. The city felt familiar, not threatening. She passed restaurants, offices, people arguing and laughing, all unaware of how close they might be to a turning point of their own. At home, she watered the plants on her porch and checked the mail. Among bills and flyers was a handwritten card from Samuel. Short, simple. He thanked her for dinner the night before and reminded her to rest. Clara smiled. She had learned that love did not have to arrive loudly. It could exist quietly, without ownership, without fear. That evening, Clara sat with a book as the sun went down. She thought about how many women had written to her over the years. How many lives had shifted not because of dramatic rescue, but because someone finally said, "You're not imagining this." The world had not become kinder overnight. Systems still failed people. Power still protected itself. But Clara no longer felt small inside it. She had built a life rooted in truth, dignity, and choice. No one could take that from her. No one ever would. And that was enough. Because sometimes the greatest ending is not applause or revenge. It is peace that lasts.